Just make one observation on this week's parasha that we're going to read, Parashat Mishpatim. So the Torah, the beginning of the parasha, tells us about Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave. We just came out of slavery. Now the Torah is telling us that it's possible that a Jewish man can own a Jewish slave. Torah tells us that his sentence is for 6 years, and in the 7th year, he goes out free. Next pasuk comes along and says, "Im begapo yabo, begapo yetzeh." Now this is a great discussion. If the Eved Ivri comes in begapo, he must leave begapo. So he leaves with the same begapo that he came in with. The question is, what is begapo? So the Targum Unkelus comes along and says, Im bilhodohi. Bilhodohi means he came in single. Or as we would say in the vernacular, he came in as a bachelor. He's unmarried. So if he comes in unmarried, he leaves unmarried. Torah then says, Im ba'al ishahu, but if he comes in as a married man, which means now he's a double eved, but if he comes in as a married man, v'yatze'a ishto imo. So the Torah says that when he leaves with his wife. Now I'd like to introduce what the Gemara says on this pasuk in Kiddushin on Daf Chaf. The Gemara says that we know that one of the rights of a master is not only to own an Eved Ivri, but he can also provide the Eved Ivri with a shifha, to be his mate. Now, what's the advantage of the owner to give a shifha to the Eved Ivri? They produce children. And what's the advantage of these children? Because these children are born automatic abadim. So basically, the Eved Ivri, by now mating with a shifha, turns into an Eved factory. Because the more children that's born, those children now become abadim of the master. So that's one of the options, or one of the benefits of owning an Eved Ivri. You could provide him with a shifha. And as a result, the banim and the banot will always remain by the master. It was even when the Eved goes free, the shifha that he was mating with and the children will always remain by the original master. Fine. The Gemara says, however, a very interesting law that needs a logic. The law is as follows. If the Eved comes in begapo, if he comes in a bachelor, in that situation, the Adon is not allowed to provide for Mishifha. The Gemara is learning the pasuk as if it says, if he comes in as a bachelor, he must remain single the whole time. He must enter and remain a gapo until he leaves. The Adon cannot provide a single Eved with a Shifha. But if he's married already, in that case, the Torah says you can give him a second wife, let's say, to mate with. That's a Shifha Kenani. And Rashi, by the way, brings this down. I'm not saying anything that you don't know already. Rashi says on the pasuk, Im begapo yavo, shelo haya nasui isha, magi, sheim lo haya nasui mitechila, if he was not married, en rabo mosed lo shifha kena'anit, leholid mimena abadim. So the Or HaChaim HaKadosh of Chaim ben Attar, our great rabbi, comes along and he says, what in the world is the logic of this law? He says, I'm well aware that it's a hook, that the Torah really doesn't give the reason, but we have to try to figure out a distinction in the law. Why should it make a difference if he's single or married? If it's permissible to give him a shifha, it should always be permissible. And it's forbidden, it should always be forbidden. Why do we make this distinction? That's the question of Orhem HaKadosh. Now the Hidush of this piece is incredible because not only does he give you a logical reason, but he says the reason actually is written in the text itself, which is a novel way of understanding. Let's look at the next pasuk. Im Adonav yiten lo isha. If the master will give him a wife. Now what case must that be with? That must be where he's married already. Because we learned already that the only time you can give the servant a wife is if he's married. So im Adonav yiten lo isha, if he gives him a wife, v'yalda lo banim ubanot, and the isha, the shefcha, has sons and daughters, ha'isha v'yiladea tiyeh ladoneha. The new wife, the shefcha, remains to the master with the children. Vehu, the Eved, yitzeh begapo. He goes out alone. Well, that's not true. He doesn't go out alone. He goes out with his original wife. So why would the pasuk say Vehu yitzeh begapo? He's not going out alone at all. He still has his first wife. So based on this diuk, the Orhem HaKadosh makes the following hidush. He says this pasuk is giving you the reason why a single Eved is not provided a Shefcha Kena'anit. And the reason is as follows. We must ask ourselves a fundamental question. Does the Torah want Jews to be avadim to people? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, if an Eved after 6 years comes along and wants to extend his avdut, the Torah says he must be punished. We take him to the doorpost and we pierce his ear, as if to say, your ear is blemished because you didn't hear good. Because at Har Sinai, I told you, God says, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim avadayhem. God says, you are my slaves, velo avadim la'avadim. God does not want us to be slaves to humans. God wants us exclusively to be served and serve Him. So therefore the Torah is against really this situation. It's a necessary evil. If a person is forced to sell himself into slavehood, the Torah says get out as quick as you can. We don't want this situation to last longer than it has to. And therefore, says the Orhem HaKadosh, we clearly do not want to incentivize the Eved to stay. As a matter of fact, we want to de-incentify him. We want to give him an incentive to leave. Now he gives the hypothetical. Let's say you had a guy came in single. The guy's miskeen. He's an Eved, doesn't have a wife, doesn't have children, doesn't have a family, doesn't have a setup. And all of a sudden, what does the master do? The master said, you know what, here's a shefcha. Okay, now he has a mate. All of a sudden, they start having children. Bingo, instant family. Now, what would happen when the Torah law kicks in and says, 6 years are up, and he tells this guy, you leave, your wife and your children are staying behind. It would be very hard for him to leave. You know, it would be very hard for him to leave. First of all, now he has a wife and children, that's all he has. And if he leaves, he's going to end up being a bachelor again. So therefore, by giving him a shefcha, it's going to cause him to want to stay. And the Torah doesn't want the Eved to stay. So therefore, if he comes in as a bachelor, don't give him a shefcha. So when his term comes up, he says, listen, I came in single, I'm still single, nothing to lose, you know what? Let me get out of here, maybe I'll start a new life. But if they give him a life when he's in slavehood, so now he says, I'm happy with my life already. As a matter of fact, if I leave, I lose all this. And therefore, by giving him a shefcha, it's going to only incentivize him to want to stay. And the Torah doesn't want him to stay. Whereas if a person has a wife already, so he says, what do I care about the shefcha? I have a wife and children. I'm set up already. I don't need the shefcha. Keep the shefcha. Keep the children from the shefcha. Good luck. I'm taking my Jewish wife. I'm taking my own children. And I'll be on my way. He doesn't need an incentive. So therefore, giving the shefcha to the married man is not going to change his opinion, in most cases, when it comes to leaving. Now let's read the Pesukim. Pasuk says like this. Im Adonav yiten lo isha, this Or HaKadosh learns is a hypothetical case. That what would happen if the Adon would give this bachelor a shifcha? Again, it can't happen because it's not the law, but the Torah is speaking it out. Let's speak out what would happen. Im Adonav yiten lo isha, if the master would give this bachelor that came in isha, v'yalda lo banim ubanot, and he would end up having children, and then what? The Torah is going to say, ha'isha v'ladea ti'el adoneha, that the wife and the children are going to have to remain, therefore he's going to lose his family. Vehu, and what's going to happen to him? Yetzeh begapo, he's going to go out alone. He doesn't have a wife, his Jewish wife, and he doesn't have his shifra, and therefore because he's going to go out begapo, he's not going to want to go out. He's going to come along and say, ahabti et adoni et tishti et banai. He's going to come along and say, I love my children. Lo etzeh. And therefore, if that situation is going to happen to us, we don't want a guy to come along and now have a reason to want to stay. So therefore the Torah is saying, if the Torah would allow this person to get a wife and have children, and anyway we're going to tell him that he can't leave with his children and wife, he has two things that he loses out, says Rabbi ELI. Number one, he loses his family, and number two, when he leaves, he now is back to square one, and therefore he's going to argue and say, I'm better off staying. And the Torah says, we don't want you to stay. And therefore, there's actually not only a reason to this law, but the reason, according to the HaKadosh, is actually written explicitly in the Torah. The Or HaKadosh's language is Torah. The Torah gave the reason b'metek sefatav. B'metek sefatav, in the sweetness of the lashon, it just flows according to the beautiful reading that the Torah is telling us. No shifcha for a bachelor, because that'll only cause him to want to stay in Eved. And God says, Kili b'nei Yisrael abadim, abadai hem, velo abadim na abadim.